the right, knock him out, knock him out, knock him out for the light. One time, knock him out. Two times, knock him out, knock him out, knock him out for the light.
So I'm talking trail wisdom from an old dirt kicker. I just want to, at the beginning here, make it real clear that I'm not the one that's old. It's the dirt that's old, okay? I kick old dirt. All right, so I just want to mention that. All right, so we're talking about box. When we think in terms of thinking in a box or inside a box, outside of a box, relation to a box, it suggests that thinking can and maybe should have some types of boundaries or parameters to help us decide what to think and how to act. I believe that this metaphorical box is a product of an urban, advanced, modern society. When you live in a modern, urban, advanced society like we do, the tendency is to think in a box-related way. The reason is because it speaks to our tendency to want to categorize, define, and therefore create a sense of structure and order. Now, all that's good, but at the same time, these boundaries and parameters around the way we think can inhibit the way we solve problems and the way we make decisions. So if this is true, it begs an interesting question. Is it possible that if you live in a less civilized, less modern, less urban environment, that you would actually think more clearly, more creatively, and more in an unboxed way? And so to address that issue, I'm going to ask you to pretend that you don't live in an urban, modern society, but instead I want you to imagine that you live in the wilderness, okay? So instead of living where you live, let's say that you live, let's say that you live right here, all right? The thing is that if you live in the wilderness living is simpler, it's more basic, and if you live out there, your thinking becomes simpler, more basic, less structured, and more open. And so I believe that in the wilderness, there is no box. All right, so now what do I base this on? Well, for one thing, I've been in the wilderness a lot. For the last 50 years, I've been traveling around to some of the most remote corners of the world, usually by myself. I spent many weeks on each trip out there, so I kind of know what it's like to think out there. In addition, I'm also a social scientist. I have a degree in psychology, and I've been taught to think about how people think. So for those two reasons, I believe that if you live in a less developed, less urban, less modern society, you'll begin to think in a more open way, because I believe that in the wilderness, again, there is no box. So what I'd like to do now is to give you three basic examples of why I believe that wilderness thinking is unboxed thinking. First reason is, excuse me, in the wilderness you have to depend more on your instincts than you do at home. You're living in a situation where you have to always evaluate where you are, what your situational awareness is. You have to make decisions based on what's really immediate to you. And so what happens is your thinking becomes less boxed and more open and more, more liberated, more unboxed. I'll give you an example. So here I am on this trip once that I made up in northern Canada, and I was walking all day, and I got to this river here. And it was late at night. I was really tired. I was hungry. It had really been a tough, cold day. And I knew I had to get across this river to continue to that mountain that you see behind on the other side there. So now logic would have told me, all right, make a camp here, spend the night, get yourself a nice warm meal, and then in the morning, get up, pack up, cross the river, and keep on walking. But as I looked to the sky, I could see that it's very cloudy, and it occurred to me that if it started raining during the night, that river was going to swell up, and then getting across it in the morning may not be that easy. It may be impossible. So all things considered, I figured I better cross it right now while I still could. So I took off my boots. I got through that water. It was freezing cold. I was dog-tired. But I got to the other side. I made myself a camp on the other side. And I'm glad I did it because that night it did rain, and the river the next day was really tough. I never would have gotten across there. So it's kind of an example of when you're out there, you have to be aware of what you're doing, be aware of your surroundings, and make decisions basically on the fly, which speaks to a more unboxed way of thinking out there in the wilderness. Second reason why I believe that wilderness thinking is unboxed is because in the wilderness, it's a little less safe. It's a little less predictable than it is back in the urban, civilized world. You have to live closer to your own, closer to the edge of your comfort zone. You know, things happen where you have to make decisions that will actually be maybe life-preserving in some cases. So that causes you, again, to think in a more open way, to not put any boundaries or parameters around the way you think. But here's an example. So I saw these fresh grizzly tracks up there in the Yukon territory, and I knew they were big, and it occurred to me that very close to me was a very large grizzly bear. It wasn't in a cage, and therefore I was not at the top of the food chain. So with all the things that you have to think about in a situation like this, I'm just going to pick one, and that's the how do you preserve your food? Because I know that if a bear gets into your food, they're going to eat whatever's in there, they're going to mess it all up, and then I'm going to be in the middle of nowhere with nothing to eat. So in that situation, I was able to find a tree and string up my food at night, put it in a bag and string it up high enough that a bear couldn't get there. So that was an example of, in that situation, how you have to always think in the moment. But it doesn't happen, it doesn't work that way every single time. There are bears a lot of different places. So for example, on another trip up in Alaska, I was on the tundra. There are no trees. You know, so what do you do? So here's a photo of my campsite, if you will. It's kind of hard to see, but we're on the wrong slide. All right, so way back up there is that tiny little spot is a yellow tent. That's my campsite. Here's where I eat my food, cook and eat. You don't want to have any odors, food odors around your campsite, so you're going to camp like 100 yards away from where you eat. So what do you do with your food? So I know I'm going to have to put my food on the ground. I put it in a plastic bag, a big garbage bag, tie it up, and what I did to discourage bears was I tied a small packet of mothballs. You remember mothballs? They have this odor to it. So it occurred to me that any animal that has an acute sense of smell, when they smell those mothballs, they don't want to be anywhere near it. And it worked great. So I would tie my food up at night, tie these mothballs to it. I could leave it right on the ground, and no bears would come and bother it. Then it occurred to me, hey, maybe you should tie some of those mothballs on your tent later for the food, right? So it's just another example of how living in wilderness is more unboxed thinking that you have to go through. Third reason why I think wilderness thinking is unboxed is because, you know, it's in the wilderness. And you have fewer possessions. You have to deal with what you have. I can heat up some rocks, put them in a sock, and then at night when I go to sleep, I can put them in my sleeping bag to keep me warm. If I get hurt, if I get cut, I can use the sock as a compression bandage and help me there. So you have to kind of learn to use what you have do you have to be more ingenious, more, MacGyverish? Remember the MacGyver, that guy could do all those fancy things? You have to have that kind of thought. So wilderness thinking is unboxed. And these are 3 reasons why I believe that way. So now I can see you're all out there sitting out there and you're saying to yourself, yeah, but dude, we don't live in the wilderness. We live here. What is all this unboxed stuff? What can we take away from that? And I believe what you take away is this. The implications of what I'm saying is this, that unboxed thinking, regardless of the environment, can be a very effective way of dealing with issues and make you a better problem solver. So then that leaves the final question. Well, then how do I learn in an urban situation? How do I learn to think in an unboxed way? And I believe the answer is essentially keep it simple. Number 1, don't let your mind be too cluttered with data and information when you have to think more clearly. Number 2, practice and learn to try to think more creatively. And 3, have the courage of your convictions. Trust your instincts. Now, I know that this is a very simplified explanation, but I really believe that that is the formula that will lead you to be a person who can think without a box, and when that happens, the box disappears. So I leave you with this final thought. Unboxed thinking is a good example of how sometimes when you take a step back, keep it simple, that is the best way to move forward. Thank you very much.
With the left, with the right, knock him out, knock him out, knock him out for the light.